like to turn to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12. Read the first 3 verses. Very familiar. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. I want to notice some generalities which will give us a proper view of what is being said here. The addressees are referred to as brethren. That is the same if you go over to Romans 1, verses 6 and 7. Among whom are ye also the called of Jesus Christ. To all that be in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints. So these brethren are the called of Jesus Christ. They are the beloved of God, called to be saints, called to be sanctified, set apart, and holy. So what we read here in our text also needs to be viewed considering the mindset of Paul toward those to whom he is writing. So again, if we go over to Romans 1, verse 8. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of His Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers. So he's praying for these individuals. Verse 11, for I long to see you, and here's why, that I may impart unto you some spiritual gift. And here's the reason for that, to the end you may be established. So he has an attitude of love, concern, and a burden for their spiritual well-being. We also need to hear the words of the text as coming from this man who has a love for these people. Also, these words need to be considered in light of the purpose of the entire letter, that you may be established. That is, spiritually set, spiritually fixed, spiritually prevailing. We need to be mindful of the means of these words here in Romans 12. They flow from God through Paul. So it's not just the words of Paul, they flow from God through Paul, which reveals the authority of the words, which also reveals the weight of the words, that it is something that God would have us to do, what we read here in Romans 12. Reading our text, again, we need to notice the tone. It's a plea. He says, I beseech you, I beseech you, I beg you, I plead with you. So Paul, under the inspiration and the influence and the impulse and the leading of the Holy Spirit, is pleading, he's begging He's urging and fervently entreating the called of Jesus Christ, the beloved of God, the called to be saints, and His brethren. The fact that it is the tone of a plea reveals that the subject matter is one of urgency. What we read here in Romans 12 is an urgent matter. It is a matter of pressing need. It is something of extreme importance, consequence. It should be a matter of priority. Also, reading our text, the manner in which he addresses them should be considered. It's personal, as seen in the pronouns you, ye, and your. And we should also consider the tense in which he addresses his readers. It's present tense, it's habitual, it's continual. So what he says is for all times. What he says is under all circumstances. Reading the text, the subject matter is a way of life. It is a call to a way of life. It is a plea for every child of God to live life this way. This life is identified by several words. Unto God. That describes the direction of this life that he's pleading in behalf of. It's also referred to as reasonable service. It's referred to as holy and acceptable unto God. And we read in verse 3 of the will of God. And all of this is to be voluntary and carried out in the spirit of readiness and cheerfulness, as seen in the word present. So our text tells us there is a God-designed life that we are to live. A life vitally connected to God. A life vitally connected to service. And a life vitally connected to that which is holy and acceptable unto God. And a life vitally connected to the will of God. It is a life in conformity to these things. It is a life that involves body and mind. Reading the text, the basis of the plea is the mercies of God. That has reference to what Paul had already mentioned in the letter prior to the text. It would be inclusive of God's grace in election, in predestination, in adoption, in atonement, in reconciliation, in justification, in regeneration, in calling, in repentance, in faith, in providence, in God's provision, in God's protection. It's all due to the mercies of God. So God is the basis and the motivation to obey what Paul is presenting. So in verses 1 and 2, Paul is pleading with them concerning a duty, an obligation regarding their life in relation to God. And what should compel them to that life is God has been merciful to you in saving your soul. But I want to take the thought this morning from verse 3. The opening word in verse 3 is for, which simply means with respect to. It refers back, of course, to the duty and obligation that is stated in verses 1 and 2. So what he's saying in verse 3 refers back to verses 1 and 2. He says, "For I say through, or by the means or agency of the grace given bestowed unto me, to every man, that's his brethren, be called, and so on, that is among you, all the brethren. So what he says concerns all the saved that he's writing to. The duty and the obligation is for all the brethren. No one is exempt. And what he's about to say, again, is for every one of them. What we read in verse 3 is vitally necessary to what is said in verses 1 and 2. Now notice the words, the phrase, the measure of faith. That's how verse 3 closes. The measure of faith. This is vitally important to verses 1 and 2. It is a necessity to verses 1 and 2. Faith. So I want to speak this morning on assessing our stature of faith. It is referred to as the measure of faith. How do we assess our stature of faith? Well, we can assess it by where we are in verses 1 and 2. Verses 1 and 2 require faith. So let's look briefly at the logical life that you and I, the saved, are called to live. What we are called to do is referred to in verse 1 as our reasonable service. And in light of who God is, and in light of what He has done in grace and mercy toward us, what is being said in verses 1 and 2 is the logical and sensible way for a child of God to live. If we live any other way, it's illogical. And it doesn't make sense. So what is said here in verses 1 and 2 is not extreme. It's not excessive. But it's appropriate to the mercies of God toward us. It's suitable to the mercies of God. It's reasonable. It is a life that involves total dedication. In verse 1, you have ye and your, and you have those two words, unto God. Unto God. So it is a duty and a life that involves losing sight of ourselves and being absorbed with God. And this is reasonable. It is something that we want to do. It is done in a spirit of readiness and cheerfulness. And it's voluntary, again indicated by that word present. Present. It is a duty and life of surrender. That ye present your bodies a living sacrifice. In other words, that ye present yourself a sacrifice in life unto God. Unto God. It is hand over your lives to the Lord. Let go. Relinquish all claim upon your life. It is to yield the totality of our being and our life to God. It is acting upon the realization that God has all rights and all claims upon our lives. Most of God's people will vocally say, yes, God has all claim on my life, but they don't believe that. And they certainly don't practice it. We need to be a people drawn and compelled. And what draws us and compels us is the mercies of God. But we need to be a people drawn and compelled to present ourselves unto God. And again, this has its basis, this has its motivation in the fact that we are the blessed recipients of His saving mercy. We see also it is a life, the life we're called to live, involves a separation. It is first a separation unto the Lord. And then it is a separation from the world. Verse 2, and be not conformed to the world. But that follows, present yourselves unto God. The word conform, of course, means to be formed, to be fashioned in accordance with. We're not to be formed and fashioned in accordance with the world. It is basically saying, do not let the world penetrate your soul. Live above the course of the world. We are to resist, and we are to live above the course of the world's philosophies, the world's reasonings. Do not let the world's reasonings penetrate your soul. Do not let the ways of the world penetrate your soul. Do not get so caught up with the pursuits and the ideals of the world. Why? Because the world has a system as antagonistic toward the truth of God. And it's selfish and it's earthly minded. The world is man-centered. And what we're called to do is God-centered. Two complete opposites. The child of God must not allow themselves to be cast into the mold of the world. Must not be engulfed in the world's thinking or the world's way of thinking. It is a life that involves inner transformation, verse 2, but that is, rather than conformity to the world's system, be ye transformed. That is, be ye changed, transfigured, overhauled, and remade. And this is ongoing. It's never ending. So it goes beyond the superficial. It goes beyond an external facade. It is a radical inward spiritual progression. How do we do that? Well, it tells us by the renewing, the reviving of your mind. In this world, our mind needs constant reviving. It is a radical inward spiritual progression. By renew your mind, by the renewing of your mind, that is again and again and again and again, renew your mind. That tells us something about the character of the world in which we live. We need to again and again and again renew our minds. And this happens as we are presented to the Lord. You can't get away from that. Present yourselves unto God. Be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. Well, how do you do that? You live in verse 1. That's how we renew our mind. You do verse 1. Then in verse 3, for with respect to, referring to, verses 1 and 2, I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. So with those words, Paul presents a danger. He presents a hindrance to the life that is presented in verses 1 and 2. If we think highly of ourselves, we will not live in verses 1 and 2. In verse, the elevation of self in one's mind is in direct opposition to everything that is said in verses 1 and 2. Pride will keep us out of verses 1 and 2. So that brings us to that which is vitally necessary. Verse 3. But to think soberly, rather than thinking highly of yourselves, think soberly. Rather than the sinful thinking of pride, which is the opposite of sober thinking. So it brings us into the realm of intoxication. It is an intoxication with self. Rather than being intoxicated with self, think soberly. And this is necessary to verses 1 and 2. The words think soberly. Again, just the opposite of intoxication. It draws the picture of clear and unclouded thinking. That which is sensible. That which is rational. So if we do not live in verses 1 and 2, we're not thinking soberly. We're not thinking clearly. We're not thinking sensibly. We're not thinking rationally in regard to God's mercies toward us. So to think soberly is in contrast to thinking highly of ourselves. Any kind of thinking that prevents us from living in verses 1 and 2 is not sober thinking. But rather it's a state of intoxication. It's extremely dangerous. It is harmful to yourself and to those around you to live in a state of intoxication. And so it is spiritually also. It is extremely unprofitable. And it's wasteful to live life intoxicated. And so it is spiritually. Wrong thinking is a state of being intoxicated. Any kind of thinking that keeps us out of verses 1 and 2 is the direct opposite of think soberly. To think soberly is a necessity to living life in verses 1 and 2. Which brings us to another necessity. Notice, think soberly according as. That is, in accord with, God hath dealt to every man. Who's the every man? The brethren. Those he referred to in Romans 1, 6 and 7. the measure of faith. Sober thinking, which is necessary to living life in verses 1 and 2, is in harmony with faith. With faith. So from this, we see that a lack of faith produces wrong thinking, which in turn results in a failure to live in verses 1 and 2. You know why we don't live in verses 1 and 2? Because we don't think right. And you know why we don't think right? Lack of faith. That's what this is saying. So one's thinking is determined by their measure of faith. A life influenced and controlled by faith will be a life lived in verses 1 and 2. So what is faith? Faith is assent, agreement with what God says. Any other kind of thinking is wrong thinking. Faith is to be persuaded by the fact of God. Faith is confidence in God. Faith is dependence and reliance upon God. Faith is unreserved trust in God. And this will bring you to verses 1 and 2. Faith is leaning upon God. Faith is resting upon God. Faith is cleaving to God. Faith is looking to God. Faith is coming to God. Faith is casting oneself upon God. Faith really boils down to this, is living in the reality of God. That's faith. And living in the reality of God puts you in verses 1 and 2. If we live in the reality of God, we will live in verses 1 and 2. But again, it requires faith. Faith is letting go. So much so that we are willing to present ourselves unto God. Faith is seeing God. It sees God. Faith embraces God. It lays hold of God. Faith is anticipation of God. Faith is believing. Faith is acting upon what is believed. Faith, again, puts you in verses 1 and 2. Faith is energetic. All through the Scriptures, it's presented as living. It's energetic, it's vibrant, it's forceful, it's powerful. It's an enabling energy. Faith. Faith enables you to live in verses 1 and 2. Faith is impactful. It impacts your life. Faith is living life connected to God. Again, living in reality, in the reality of God. It's connected to God. And it is absolutely necessary to thinking soberly. And the one who thinks soberly has no problem, has no argument, wants it no other way than what we read in verses 1 and 2. If you're thinking right, you don't have a problem with verses 1 and 2. None whatsoever. And faith is necessary to sober thinking. We can assess our faith, and we can assess our thinking by what degree our life is impacted by verses 1 and 2. The quality of spiritual life, our degree of living for the Lord, our degree of following the Lord, our prayer life, our love for the Lord, our enjoyment of the Lord, our peace, our assurance, our zeal, our endurance in the Lord's cause are all in harmony with faith. Faith is an absolute necessity. And this is why Jesus Christ said to the apostles in Mark 11 verse 22, have faith in God. Have faith in God. Again, Romans 12, 1 and 2. When you get down to verse 3, is the way to ascertain the will of God. You're not in a position to ascertain the will of God if you're not living in verses 1 and 2. The way to live to the honor and glory of God. The way to live the most useful and productive life. The way to thrive spiritually. The way to stay right with God. The way to be happy and enjoy God is verses 1 and 2. And it's all in harmony with a measure of faith. That word measure of faith shows that there's degrees of faith. And again, we can assess our faith by examining where do we fit in verses 1 and 2. We must assess our faith. We must assess our thinking. The two are linked. The two are linked. They're not separate. And a proper assessment is where we are in verses 1 and 2. We need a faith. We need a faith that transcends, that surpasses, that goes beyond, that outlasts and is bigger and larger than all obstacles in the way. That transcends all the difficulties and all the inconveniences and all the circumstances and all the trials and all impossibilities. A faith that will stand in the storm and say, I believe God, that it shall be as it was told me. A faith that believes against hope. A faith that believes when all hope is gone. A faith that enables us to put Christ first. You see, the reason people have priority problems is lack of faith. A faith that believes against hope. A faith that cleaves to God. A faith that cleaves to His Word. A faith that bows and worships God no matter what. The measure of faith that we so desperately need does not lose sight of the mercies of God, because that's the basis. It enables us and causes us to live life in verses 1 and 2. So we can properly assess our degree of faith by honestly examining Where am I in verses 1 and 2? Where am I? We need a faith that makes God more of a reality than anything else. But I don't believe in all this faith stuff. I'm a realist. Faith gives reality. A faith that makes the Word of God come to life in our hearts. That's faith. A faith that causes us to love Him more. The more we love Him, the less problem we have with verses 1 and 2. A faith that enables us to see Him. A faith that enables us to look to Him for all things. A faith, again, that causes us to lean upon Him more heavily and to draw from Him. A faith that will cause us to rely upon Him to a greater degree. A faith that causes us to realize God is more than anything else. He's more beneficial than anything else. A faith that causes us to desire and seek the heavenly over the earthly. Faith knows that there's a spiritual and there's a temporal. Faith also knows the difference between the two. And faith prefers the spiritual over the temporal. It is a faith that causes us to be more occupied and obsessed with God. The more occupied we are with God, the less problem you have with verses 1 and 2. Immediately someone says, well, I don't have a problem with verses 1 and 2. Oh, we all do. We all do. A faith that would cause us to be more directed and governed by God rather than the world. What is the directing force in our life? God or the world? A faith that lessens our attachment to the world. A faith that will keep us from being weighted down with the things and the pursuits of the world. A faith that will keep us from being distracted by the world. The best life that we can live in this world is described in Romans 12, 1 and 2. There's no better way to live life. Just give yourself to God. No better way to live life. But that requires faith. It requires the measure of faith. We need to assess every day, several times a day, our faith. What is my faith? And we do that by a thorough examination of our spiritual mindset. You can't separate faith from the mindset. Faith affects our mindset. Faith determines our mindset. And our mindset determines our manner of living. And our manner of living ought to be Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. But we need faith. We need faith. Again, you can't just roll out of bed and say, I'm going to live in Romans 12:1 and 2. It doesn't work. Well, I'm going to work at it more. It doesn't work. You need faith. Because you need to think differently. And that requires faith. So we say with the apostles, Luke 17:5, Lord, increase our faith. You have a desire to live in Romans 12:1 and 2? Lord, increase our faith. That's what will put you in Romans 12:1 and 2. Oh, we need faith. We need more faith. And we need more and more and more. We need faith desperately. It's a vital necessity to the life that we're called to live. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us a verse of song, we'll all